Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey to truly understand the making of a figure who has profoundly shaped our modern world. For those of you who seek a deeper, more immersive understanding of complex lives, well, prepare to settle in.
Yeah, our focus today is on the formative years and the gradual accumulation of influence by Vladimir Putin. We'll be tracing his path from his early life right through the initial phases of his leadership, trying to understand the crucial influences and, the pivotal moments that really molded this undeniably significant individual.
We really aim for this to be a thoughtful exploration, a calm and reflective journey through a life lived, let's face it, on a global stage. Our intention is to offer you, our listener, a meaningful and hopefully lasting experience, one that resonates with some genuine insight.
Absolutely. The mission of this deep dive is pretty clear, to unravel the key factors that define Vladimir Putin's trajectory. We'll start in post-war Leningrad, a city still bearing the deep, deep scars of conflict, and follow his development through those formative experiences, culminating in the early years of his presidency.
Okay, let's begin by setting the scene then. Leningrad in 1952, it's, I think, really vital to grasp the profound historical context in which Putin's life began. It was a city just deeply marked by the immense trauma of the siege.
Oh, absolutely. The war had ended only 7 years before, but its presence was just palpable. You have to imagine a silence that wasn't just peace, but one echoing with absence. A city where the very air seemed heavy with the memory of, what was it, over 1 million civilians who perished during that 872-day Nazi blockade. The hardship endured was almost unimaginable.
Over 1 million lives. It's just a staggering number to comprehend. And the conditions they face, the accounts we've looked at detail such extreme deprivation. Starvation driving people to boil leather, eating glue, desperately hunting rats. And there were those darker whispers too, weren't there? About survival at any cost.
Exactly. And the physical environment itself mirrored this trauma.
Yeah.
Enduring the relentless winter snows, the biting cold, it was a constant struggle. This wasn't just a city rebuilding its structures. It was a community still profoundly, in mourning, deeply traumatized. And into this environment, Vladimir Putin was born on October 7, 1952. His family's history was deeply interwoven with the war's devastation.
Yeah, his father, Vladimir Spiridonovich, he'd served in a special sabotage brigade during the war, wounded twice. And his mother, Maria Ivanovna, she nearly died from hunger during the siege itself, actually losing her first child, Putin's older brother, who didn't survive.
Right, so when Vladimir was born, he was their third child, but tragically the only one living at that point.
Yeah.
This context of profound loss, but also resilience, it's just paramount to understanding his early world. It wasn't a childhood of, let's say, promise or boundless opportunity in the way we might think of it. It was one shaped by the immediate aftermath of immense trauma and survival.
And their home reflected this reality. A fifth-floor room in a communal apartment, a kommunalka. This was typical Soviet post-war living.
Very typical.
Yeah.
And the kommunalka, it wasn't just a building. It was really a defining condition of life for millions. It was this constant negotiation of shared space, shared resources, very limited privacy. You have to picture 5 or 6 families living on a single floor in one of these gray, sort of functional post-war blocks. Privacy was basically non-existent.
It sounds incredibly intense.
It was. The sensory details alone. Think of the long, often dimly lit hallway, the pervasive smells from the shared kitchen cabbage, maybe some oil, cigarette smoke lingering, and the shared toilet. Sometimes occupied, sometimes clogged, sometimes worse. Living conditions were incredibly cramped. His family's room, less than 20 square meters.
Tiny.
Tiny. No central heating, no washing machine. In winter, you'd get ice forming inside the windows. Summers meant flies. And the thin walls. Arguments, whether hushed whispers or drunken rages from neighbors, were just part of the background noise.
And his own sleeping arrangement.
A simple folding couch right there in that small room. Basic furnishings. A table, a cupboard, a radio. That was pretty much it. And the room itself, you imagine it holding these echoes of the past, old Soviet books maybe. Some empty ration tins, perhaps war medals tucked away, silent reminders.
What about his parents in this setting?
His mother, Maria, is described as quiet, thin, often unwell. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich, the war veteran turned factory foreman, comes across as silent, quite severe. He provides structure, rules, but maybe not a lot of overt warmth.
It's quite revealing that Putin himself later described it so simply. We lived simply, but everyone lived that way.
It is. It speaks volumes about how shared hardship in that Soviet system could become almost normalized, just the way things were. But the impact of the communalka on a child, especially someone like Putin, must have been profound. It forced a constant guarding of the personal, a heightened awareness of who might be listening, who was watching.
Space itself becomes a form of power.
Exactly. And listening, observing the dynamics in those close quarters, often proved far more valuable than speaking out rashly. He became, by all accounts, a keen observer within this environment, noting who held sway in the hallway, who shouted, who drank too much, who might be eavesdropping.
There's nowhere to hide, really.
Nowhere to hide, nowhere to scream without everyone knowing. So it fostered this emphasis on controlled presentation, on carefully defending your tiny bit of personal space and your few possessions. Even daily routines were a struggle, fighting for bathroom time, windowsill space, a clean spoon, the last piece of bread. Conflict, especially among kids, wasn't seen as abnormal. It was almost a social mechanism to figure out your place.
So his early dreams weren't political grandiosity.
No, not at all. The sources suggest his early aspirations were much more fundamental. Quiet, control over his immediate environment, and the ability to choose when to be seen and when to blend in. The Komunalka, in a way, was his first real schooling in how systems work, the dynamics of tension, posture, silence, timing. All learned before any formal ideology or politics. Survival meant knowing when to disappear and when you absolutely had to push back. That constant lack of privacy probably fostered a deep need for control over his image and information later on.
Moving beyond the Komunalka, the sources highlight another key aspect of his youth. This idea of him being a boy with both fists and books. It wasn't just about observation.
No, the physical side was crucial early on, perhaps even primary, before the intellectual curiosity really kicked in. He was small for his age, had a quick temper, and tended to be a bit of a loner. The courtyards outside the apartment blocks were a different kind of proving ground.
Not exactly playgrounds.
Yeah. Definitely not. Think informal spaces where kids formed these territorial gangs using sticks, stones, fists, whatever was at hand, to establish dominance over little patches of Leningrad concrete. Initially, Vladimir didn't fare well. He lost most of those early fights.
But he kept coming back.
That's the key point, his persistence. He kept showing up, even after losing. These were brutal brawls, no glory, no rules, just survival and testing limits. Could you hold a stare, take a punch without crying? He learned early on that if size wasn't on his side, maybe willpower could be. And later, strategy.
Then came the turning point with martial arts.
Yes, around age 11, he found this dusty neighborhood sports club teaching Sambo, that Soviet mix of judo and street wrestling. The place sounds basic. No windows, just mats, sweat. But the emphasis was on discipline.
And Sambo's principles appealed to him.
Deeply. Balance, using momentum, leverage, timing. He apparently took to it with his quiet, obsessive focus, training constantly.
Did it change him?
By 13, yes. Not necessarily taller, but more contained. That childhood rage seemed folded inward, sharpened, more controlled. Then he transitioned to judo, which seems to have had an even deeper impact.
How so? More than just fighting.
Exactly.
Huh.
Judo came with this sort of spiritual code. It wasn't just about overpowering someone. It was about understanding them, introspection, control, calculation. He studied the judo greats, stayed late practicing. By 16, he's competing regionally, winning titles by 17.
What was the big lesson from judo, do you think?
Probably discovering how to use an opponent's energy against them, that the calmest fighter often wins, and that invisibility, being underestimated, could be more powerful than obvious presence.
And this coincided with his interest in reading.
Yeah, driven by his own curiosity, not school. He was drawn to Soviet war memoirs, spies, saboteurs, secret operatives, the whole narrative of the Great Patriotic War, intelligence work saving the motherland. He liked the idea of these quiet, unseen men.
Fiction, too.
NKVD stories, apparently. Things of loyalty, betrayal. He started imagining himself in their place, watching patiently, acting at the perfect moment, then vanishing. School was still boring, but he started getting better grades, maybe seeing them as necessary for a future goal.
Which was?
An undeclared childhood ambition, joining the KGB. It wasn't about ideology, not really. It was about mastering those hidden rules, the unseen power structures. He saw the spy as someone who moved the world unseen. In a world of thin walls and feeling physically small, that kind of power must have seemed incredibly appealing.
This fascination with the unseen, combined with his courtyard and communalka experiences, really points towards observation becoming a key skill, almost a way of life. watching from the corners.
Absolutely. It became almost instinctual for him. In crowded rooms, he'd drift to the edges near a wall, avoiding the center. He learned a fundamental lesson in those Leningrad courtyards and kitchens. The most dangerous person often isn't the loudest, but the quiet one who watches, remembers everything, and reveals nothing.
He wasn't just watching actions, but nuances.
Precisely. Subtle shifts in tone, insincere smiles, unspoken tensions, observing arguments between neighbors who yielded first. Why? Noticing how teachers changed their demeanor depending on who was present. Watching party officials, seeing the gap between public pronouncements and private weariness.
And not judging, just collecting data.
Exactly. Memorizing patterns, reactions, calculating risks based on what he saw. By his teens, he developed these two languages. The public one, short answers, politeness, stillness, and the private one, this internal vocabulary of patterns, reactions, risk assessment.
So he wasn't a loud kid, not a leader.
No, rarely raised his voice, not a star student. But crucially, he rarely made mistakes. Avoided gossip, didn't overreach, didn't forget things. Classmates later described him as there but never fully present, like an observant shadow.
Even his choice of German in school fits this pattern.
It seems to. Not for the culture or conversation, but for the mechanics, the logic, structure, precision. His later fluency served him well in Drosen, of course, but it suggests he saw language as a tool for accessing systems, not necessarily expressing himself.
And he was building these mental maps outside school, too.
Yes, mapping the social landscape. Favors owed, hierarchies among the boys, teachers' habits, which you could and couldn't say to adults. It wasn't paranoia, more like navigation in a state built on a degree of mistrust where rules could shift. His instincts became his education.
So less an ideologue, more a systems survivor.
Very much so. That proverb, "He who is warned is armed," wasn't just a saying for him. It sounds like it became a core operating principle learned very early on.
All this careful observation, this preference for the periphery, it seems to have culminated in him mastering the art of becoming almost invisible, realizing that being underestimated could be a form of power.
Exactly. By 16, he was unusual in that way. Not feared, not admired, not mocked, just difficult to define. He'd learned to keep enough distance to be familiar, but ultimately unknowable. He mastered vanishing in plain sight.
And in Soviet society, visibility could be risky.
Very risky. Attention often led to questions, and questions could lead to trouble. He absorbed this from his surroundings, his father's silence on war stories, neighbors not mentioning arrests, newspapers praising people who then disappeared. He learned silence wasn't weakness, it was a tool.
Which makes his decision to study law at Leningrad State University seem quite strategic.
Highly strategic. Not glamorous, but it offered access, sent the right signals, especially if his underlying ambition was still the KGB. He seemed to understand they didn't recruit people who asked, but people who fit the profile.
What was that profile, generally?
Disciplined, loyal, emotionally opaque. Intelligent but not outspoken. Sharp but not flashy. Capable but ultimately replaceable within the machine.
And he consciously shaped himself to fit this at university.
The account suggests so. Dark clothes, punctuality, avoiding ideological arguments, few close friends. Professors noted diligence, not brilliance. He did nothing wrong, nothing surprising. He understood that in a fear-based system, the most powerful person might be the one nobody notices until it's too late.
Which led to that quiet approach from the KGB.
Yes, undramatic, almost understated. During his final university years, "We've been watching, you've done well." And his reaction, no smile, just listening, nodding. The mask had worked. The boy from Leningrad had become what the system needed. A man who could disappear within it, ready to be used.
So this carefully crafted persona, the law degree, it all opened the door to the next chapter, the KGB years. Not destiny, but selection by the system itself.
Precisely. The invitation wasn't some grand announcement. It was a discreet suggestion, almost an assumption. Near the end of his law studies, summoned to that office with the windows that didn't fully open.
A subtle detail.
Isn't it? And the questioning was calm, measured. Law, discipline, loyalty, feelings about the country, trust in its institutions. Less an interview, more a quiet assessment, a final check.
And he passed.
He passed. The quiet statement followed. "We think you can be useful." The KGB wasn't looking for dreamers or heroes. They wanted functionaries. Obedient, inconspicuous men who could blend in. Putin fit the mold perfectly.
So he joins officially in 1975.
Upon graduation, official title, Case Officer, 1st Chief Directorate Foreign Intelligence. Most people, even professors, barely noticed. He entered a profession demanding footprintless agents.
And the training at the Andropov Red Banner Institute.
The elite academy, yes, shaping future secrecy architects. He learned the skills. following unseen, recruiting without showing interest, listening without interrupting, exploiting weaknesses, personal, bureaucratic, even vocal tics.
What kind of weaknesses?
Anything, really. Counterintelligence, disinformation, dead drops, surveillance craft. But the core lesson went beyond tactics. People are unreliable, structures are not. Loyalty must be managed. Truth's utility depends entirely on the goal.
And his profile among the recruits.
Competent, efficient, quiet, didn't ask questions, gave no reason for others to ask him any. Late 1970s KGB files apparently described him as disciplined, reserved, conforms fully.
High praise in that system.
The highest praise. A blank page for the state to write on, which is why his first foreign posting wasn't a major Western capital, but Dresden, East Germany. Quiet city, quiet job, for a man trained to make no noise.
Dresden in 1985. 40 years after the bombing, still bearing scars. It must have felt like a silent posting within a slowly failing empire.
Very much so. Orderly streets, but a heavy silence. East Germany was the model socialist state on paper, but the reality was shortages, paranoia, quiet decay. Major Vladimir Putin, 32, arrives from Leningrad, lives in a modest KGB villa behind some trees.
His official role, liaison with the Stasi.
Right. But unofficially, intelligence gathering, scientific and industrial espionage, assessing potential turns, people who could be recruited. Primarily, though, he was an observer.
And the Stasi thought he was unremarkable.
Competent, loyal, unremarkable. Low profile, fluent German, rarely drank, dutiful, made no enemies. He wasn't a movie spy, he was a network builder, patiently cultivating leverage.
Identifying vulnerabilities again.
Exactly. Students curious about the West, struggling engineers, party members with visa issues, logging names, measuring the cracks, waiting. Not seduction, but data mining human instincts.
But the real lesson wasn't what he did, but what he saw.
That seems to be the consensus. Late 80s East Germany was rotting internally. Loss of belief in Marxism, Moscow, even in fear itself. Antennas pointing west, currency leaks, collapsing morale, even Stasi agents whispering doubts.
Then came 1989, the breaking point.
December 5th, angry demonstrators approaching the KGB headquarters. Putin's inside. He calls the Soviet garrison for backup, and the response is that chilling line. We cannot do anything without orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent.
A defining moment.
A core trauma, he later called it. A mob at the gates, an abandoned power center, a paralyzed superpower. It became clear, he said, the country was no more. The Union was sick.
And the next day, burning documents.
Hours of burning files, names, evidence. History erased in ash and panic. Not to protect people, but the machine itself. Within weeks, the KGB presence dissolved. Putin returns quietly to Leningrad, like leaving a collapsed house.
But profoundly changed.
He had witnessed the consequences of paralysis, of a failing center, of decay outpacing command. A lesson he would carry forward, always.
Returning to Leningrad in 1990 must have felt like entering a different world, a collapsing system, and he's now learning to interpret its ruins.
Absolutely. An unceremonious return. He immediately noticed the changes. Longer lines, a palpable uncertainty in the air, the very language of power breaking down. The Soviet Union technically existed. The flag still flew, but the rhythm was off. More volatile streets, sharper jokes, diminished authority.
He left a country, returned to a vacuum.
In many ways, yes. The KGB structure was still there, technically, but shifting, fracturing. The Berlin Wall down, Poland revolting, Baltics rising, Moscow's grip loosening. The intelligence world was restless, uncertain. Putin wasn't a rising asset anymore. He was part of a failing machine.
Outwardly calm, but observing the quiet crumbling.
Always observing. Whispers among colleagues about the coming storm. Gorbachev losing control, the old guard collapsing, the future utterly uncertain. And amidst this institutional dizziness, he makes that uncharacteristic move.
Leaving the KGB.
Official resignation in August 91, but the detachment started earlier. He recognized the structure that trained him was dissolving. I must find something else to belong to. Not fleeing, not seeking revenge, but pivoting.
Towards politics, with Anatoly Sobchak.
Yes, his former law professor, now a rising reformer in the post-Soviet chaos. It wasn't an obvious move. Putin hadn't campaigned, hadn't sought the spotlight. But he understood what Sobchak needed. Loyalty, discretion, a quiet doer, someone who understood both the street and the old system.
His whole life had prepared him for that kind of role.
In a way, yes. It was a barely noticed step from the intelligence shadows into the fog of emerging power.
And working with Sobchak, he learned to wield bureaucracy itself as a weapon, gaining power internally without seeming to seek it.
Precisely. Sobchak was this symbol of perestroika's promise, law professor turned reformist mayor of the newly renamed St. Petersburg in '91. He needed people to cut through the old Soviet red tape, fixers not talkers, people without strong ideological baggage from the past.
Enter Putin, the former student. Quiet, sharp, discreet.
Sobchak remembered him, hired him into the Committee for External Relations. Sounds dull, but it masked increasing power. Official job. Manage foreign investors, trade licenses, visas. Actual job. Navigate the murky intersection of business, politics, and power in the wild '90s.
Where lines were blurring everywhere.
Completely. State dissolving, institutions failing. KGB guys becoming bank directors, partymen becoming oligarchs. St. Petersburg was right in the thick of it. Contracts for oil, German deals, Finnish deals, shadowy port arrangements, all needed permits, connections, favors. Putin sat at the bottleneck.
Controlling the stamps, the signatures.
The yes-no answers. Not demanding bribes, not posturing, just quietly making things happen. And being remembered for it. Building that network based on reciprocity, not ideology. Knowing who owed him a faster license, a skipped inspection, needed discretion.
Few speeches, few interviews, but essential behind closed doors.
He was the guy diffusing Sobchak's political resistance, giving smooth German answers to uncomfortable questions from investors, taking quiet, efficient action when things broke down, never demanding credit. He learned you don't need to be in front to run the room, you just need to be the one who never leaves it.
And bureaucracy acted as a shield.
Yes. Sobchak faced scandals, but Putin remained untouched. Not uninvolved, maybe, but knowing when to disappear from the paper trail, minimal writing, no solo signatures, no self-exposure. By the time Sobchak's star faded, Putin had learned how to build networks without ideology, use procedure as political muscle, and rise beneath the radar.
So when Sobchak lost re-election in '96, it looked like Putin's career might end quietly. He resigned loyally, even helped Sobchak flee prosecution. No job, no office.
Seemed like the end of the line. But Moscow had other plans. The Yeltsin administration was in chaos. An ill, unstable Yeltsin surrounded by factions, oligarchs, ex-KGB, liberals, hardliners, all scrambling to secure their futures in a leadership vacuum.
They needed useful, quiet men.
Men who owed nothing to the existing factions. Pavel Borodin remembered Putin from St. Petersburg, and Anatoly Shubais was impressed by his discretion. Calls were made. Within months, Putin was invited to Moscow.
His first role there, Deputy Chief of Presidential Property Management.
Sounds dull, but it was critical. Oversaw Kremlin money and resources, real estate, vehicles, retreats, logistics, even black budgets. Managing the state's shadow infrastructure, an extension of his St. Petersburg work. Behind the curtain, beside the throne, controlling movement unseen.
And he excelled.
Quietly, rapidly, invisibly.
Yeah.
1997, presidential staff regions, foreign assets. 1998, director of the FSB, the KGB successor. 1999, secretary of the Security Council, military, intelligence policy.
Each step granting more tools, more oversight, more silence.
Little speaking, less smiling, no scandals. Arrived early, left late, took notes. Seemed unimpressive to some, perfect to others.
Then, mid-1999, the Yeltsin succession crisis.
Yeltsin, sick, cornered, needed a successor to protect his legacy. No family arrests, system intact, no revenge. Several names failed. Then the whisper. What about Putin? Loyal, safe, gets things done. No fanfare, no battle.
Just a decision made in exhaustion. August 9, 1999. Yeltsin on TV announcing Vladimirovich Putin as acting prime minister. Most Russians didn't know the name. Insiders understood. The quiet man from the corners had reached the center.
Becoming prime minister in August 1999, thrust into the heart of a dying order. It wasn't exactly a moment of triumph, more like being the last one standing.
That's a good way to put it. August 9th, state TV, midday. A clearly ill Boris Yeltsin announces Putin as acting PM, recommends him as the future leader. Then the screen cuts to this lean, pale-faced man, ill-fitting suit, tired eyes, just giving this thin lip nod, like it was routine.
Most Russians had no idea who he was. Even government insiders were asking, Putin? From where? He had no party affiliation, no constituency, no public record of speeches or vision or ambition. In the chaos of the late '90s, he just seemed like another technocrat, a desk man, an operator. Definitely not a leader.
Yet within 5 months, he's alone at the helm.
It's astonishing. And you have to remember the state Russia was in. The ruble had collapsed the year before. Male life expectancy had plummeted to 58. Regional governors acted like warlords. Chechnya was volatile. Oligarchs were buying up everything. There was no real center, just fragments.
Yeltsin, once a hero, now a symbol of dysfunction.
Sick, erratic, surrounded by self-interest. Putin was their bet on continuity. A man they thought they could shape, quiet but useful, unknown but manageable.
What were his first actions?
Very little speaking but quick movement, replacing key defense officials, starting to reassert federal control. He didn't resist the role. He accepted power like it was a briefcase cold, impersonal, inevitable.
And his first public remarks.
Pure function. We will restore order. We will protect the Russian citizen. We will not allow the country to break apart. No slogans, no poetry, just a statement of intent.
Kremlin insiders must have started wondering.
Who was this man? What did he want? Yeltsin's family assumed protection. Oligarchs assumed deference. The West assumed a transition to something more stable. Putin gave them no immediate cause for worry. That was part of the method. Not seizing control, but allowing others to hand it over, while quietly deciding not to give it back.
Then came the apartment bombings in September 1999. A brutal introduction, really. War often seems the quickest path to leadership in Russia.
It often is. September 99. Buynaksk bombing, then Moscow, Volgodonsk, another Moscow. 4 apartment buildings destroyed, over 300 dead, families buried in rubble. No warnings, no claims of responsibility, just smoke, panic, and rage.
The government blamed Chechen terrorists.
Immediately. And the Russian public, already numbed by years of post-Soviet decline and humiliation, was enraged by this terror hitting home. This is where Vladimir Putin stepped forward.
Not shouting or weeping, though.
No. Standing behind a podium, clipped tone, delivering that infamous line, "We will pursue them everywhere. If we catch them in the toilet, we will wipe them out in the toilet."
Yeah.
Crude, brutal, direct, but it was exactly what millions wanted to hear. Vengeance delivered with authority.
And he launched the Second Chechen War.
A full-scale military operation. Airstrikes, tanks, Grozny, surrounded and bombarded. Unlike the first Chechen War under Yeltsin, which was chaotic and unpopular, this one was managed differently.
Televised differently.
Very much so. State-consolidated media showed order, precision, progress, not burning villages or mass graves, but flags, maps, strong words, and always Putin, calm, prepared, commanding.
The result on his popularity.
Swift and seismic. His approval rating shot up from below 10% to over 50%. He became the embodiment of the response to terror. The message was clear. Where Yeltsin hesitated, I act. Where the state fractured, I restore. Where Russia weeps, I strike. He wasn't just a bureaucrat anymore.
But questions arose later about those bombings. Hints of FSB involvement.
Yes. Reports emerged. Questions were asked, particularly about an unexploded device found in Ryazan, allegedly planted by federal agents. Was it a genuine terrorist attack or a manufactured pretext? The full truth has never really come out publicly. Putin never addressed it directly.
By the time those questions gained traction, though.
He was already untouchable. He had delivered what Russians craved most at that moment, a sense of control, however brutal.
Then, the unexpected New Year's Eve resignation of Yeltsin, December 31st, 1999, a moment where silence itself conveyed immense power.
Absolutely. Millennium's last day. Russians watch a visibly pained Boris Yeltsin at the Kremlin podium, his voice low, sober. I am leaving. A pause. I've done all I could. I'm tired. I've made mistakes. Russia must enter the new century with new politicians. I'm giving the presidency to Vladimirovich Putin. It was resignation, not revolution. A sick man leaving, needing pardon.
And Putin's response.
Calm, controlled, expressionless. He appeared later that evening with a New Year's address. I want to assure all citizens of Russia there will be no vacuum of power. Stability will be preserved. Again, no poetry, no charisma, just certainty.
He became acting president overnight. Never elected to anything before 99. No party, no mass movement.
Yet, Russia was now his to govern. Not seized, but inherited, because everyone else, in a sense, had collapsed or stepped aside. The retrospective deal seemed clear. Yeltsin steps down, his family and inner circle are protected, the oligarchic order remains untouched, for now, and the state is handed to the one man who didn't seem to be taking too much for himself.
Power ran out of options.
And that's a good way to see it. Quiet snowfall over Moscow, Kremlin lights on. Inside the Tsar's old palace, a KGB trained man was at the top, not by storming the walls, but by waiting quietly at the gate while others burned themselves out.
So, January 2000, Putin enters the Kremlin not as a conqueror, but as a custodian of this broken order. What exactly did he inherit? Not a unified nation, surely.
Far from it. Russia at the turn of the millennium was less a coherent state, more a loose collection of territories dominated by oligarchs, disillusioned ministries clinging to old routines, and an exhausted, cynical populace.
The economy, democracy, power.
Privatized, but not stabilized. Introduced, but not institutionalized. Shifted, but definitely not settled. Oligarchs had seized control of core industries, oil, gas, metals, owning not just assets but access, controlling media outlets, influencing politicians. There was no single ruler, just many powerful figures competing for fragments of the old Soviet state.
And the institutions.
The military was in disarray after Chechnya and years of neglect. The judiciary was weakened, often influenced by bribes or political pressure. Regional governors acted almost like feudal lords, and the public was deeply cynical, tired of broken promises, and frankly, afraid of more radical change.
So he wasn't handed the reins of power, more like a vacant throne surrounded by rivals.
Exactly. But that presented an opportunity. Putin was, in a way, an outsider to the political brawls of the 90s. He had no real political base, no public commitments. He owed very little to the established factions.
How did he operate in those first months as acting president?
Quietly, deliberately. No talk of revolution, just order. He didn't challenge the oligarchs yet. He visited neglected regions, made himself visible, but remained unemotional. He made only promises he knew he could keep, offered necessary explanations, but no grand visions. He was installing himself at the center of a system that wasn't quite aware of what was happening.
The message being?
The state is returning. Not the Soviet state, not necessarily a democratic one, but a state that would act decisively without constantly asking permission. And that resonated. People were tired of improvisation, of chaos.
I didn't expect miracles, just an end to the uncertainty.
Precisely. Putin offered enforced rules in a ruleless country, even if the nature of the enforcer was still unclear. The oligarchs watched, likely believing they had created him, elevated him, assuming a mutual non-interference pact.
But they misunderstood him.
Fundamentally, he didn't necessarily want their wealth. He wanted their risk. Not their money, but their fear. He wanted control over the system, not just a share of the spoils.
And the March 2000 elections.
He didn't campaign in a populist way, didn't promise transformation. He just stood still while the country stopped spinning. He won in the first round, over 50%. Not through obvious fraud or force back then, but largely through fatigue and a quiet public relief at a predictable outcome. He hadn't risen above the system, he'd stepped into its collapse. Surrounded by power brokers, his key advantage was simple. He never promised to share the ultimate authority.
Entering his first full term, Putin wasn't focused on grand vision, but on consolidating power through appointments, particularly bringing his St. Petersburg connections to Moscow. The rise of the Siloviki.
Exactly. His early presidency wasn't defined by policy declarations, but by personnel decisions. He surrounded himself with people he knew and trusted from his St. Petersburg days, from the mayor's office, the security services, like the FSB, the networks involved in trade and contract management. These weren't famous politicians or ambitious ideologues. They were loyalists.
And these became known as the Siloviki.
Yes, the men of force. Ex-KGB, military, interior ministry veterans. Typically quiet, hierarchical bureaucrats who trusted routine and fear more than ideology. They believed in order over democracy, containment over debate. They knew how to occupy the levers of central power inconspicuously.
He wasn't dismantling institutions, but redirecting them.
Precisely. Ministry mergers, appointing regional governors instead of electing them, bringing TV stations under compliant ownership, managing parliament rather than eliminating it. No dramatic upheaval, just the slow, methodical tightening of procedural control. Putin's circle quietly ensured no power center could grow beyond the reach of the presidency.
So it wasn't ideology driving it, but networks.
Loyalty trumped logic. Appointing trusted men, granting them access, often without much oversight, but demanding absolute alignment in return. The Western press at the time wasn't sure what to make of him, modernizer, pragmatist. But inside the Kremlin, a different picture was emerging. Restoring an older version of Russia, perhaps without the Soviet theatrics, but with an efficient, ideology-free control machine.
There was that reported private comment, "We must rebuild the vertical of power."
Not just a metaphor, it was the blueprint.
This quiet consolidation continued throughout the early 2000s. Outwardly, Russia seemed calmer.
Yes, inflation slowed, pensions started getting paid more regularly, military morale improved slightly. Moscow was thriving with foreign investment and rising oil money. The headlines praised stability.
But behind the scenes, the stability was being carefully manufactured.
With precision. He wasn't banning parties outright, but redesigning the electoral system to exclude smaller ones. Not abolishing press freedom entirely, but allowing speech until networks were bought by Kremlin-friendly entities or sued into silence. Not declaring emergency powers, but using legislation, appointments, restructuring. Every law, every reform seemed to have an intended and an unintended but useful consequence. Pulling the right threads to make the curtain fall without obviously ripping it.
What were some key moves?
Appointing regional governors instead of electing them was huge. The Federation Council, the upper house of parliament, became largely ceremonial. The judiciary started seeing more politically convenient rulings. The tax code was streamlined, yes, but also used selectively to neutralize potential opponents.
The goal was centralization.
Restructuring the state so no significant decision bypassed the center. Not necessarily making Russia an overt dictatorship at that stage, but ensuring all consequential actions required his implicit or explicit consent. This consolidation was often bloodless, achieved through paperwork, decrees, appointments. While Western leaders were welcoming him to summits, Putin was quietly rewiring the circuits of power, not by shouting, but by waiting, outlasting.
And the oligarchs, the kingmakers of the 90s, felt this shift.
Definitely. The pivotal moment was the 2003 arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, head of Yukos Oil, on tax evasion charges. It wasn't just about law, it was drawing a very clear line. You can keep your wealth, but do not challenge the state.
How did the other oligarchs react?
They understood the message instantly. Some fled the country, others submitted, falling quietly into line. The genius of Putin's approach was making control feel procedural, not just brutal. Courts existed, ballots were cast, laws were passed, but they increasingly pointed in only one direction, never challenging the center.
By 2004, the legal and institutional framework was largely restructured. But he needed something deeper than just control.
Yes, legal control wasn't enough. Power needed to be felt, almost instinctually. He turned to something the Soviets had mastered, the architecture of national myth. The Soviet legacy itself was disgraced, Marxism was gone, the red banners folded away, but the emotional imprint remained, that longing for greatness, for sacrifice, for collective pride.
He wasn't resurrecting the USSR, but creating hybrid nationalism.
Exactly. Subtly reviving symbols, phrases, postures from both Soviet and even pre-Soviet Tsarist history, weaving them into a new narrative. Not communist, not Tsarist, but distinctively Putinist.
How did this manifest?
State TV started airing endless documentaries about World War II, the Great Patriotic War. Vintry Day parades became massive, elaborate affairs, tanks, orchestras, portraits of veterans, and Putin was always there at the quiet, composed center of it all.
Offering belonging, not utopia.
Precisely. The key themes were consistent. Russia is eternal. The West seeks to weaken us. Chaos comes from a weak state. Order is protection, not repression. Questioning the center risks collapse. These weren't just talking points. They were emotional scaffolding. And it worked in a society traumatized by the chaos of the 90s, where many craved dignity even more than democracy.
He gave them ritual, narrative, direction.
And asked for trust without oversight in return. School curriculums were revised, emphasizing national strength over historical complexity. NGOs receiving foreign support were labeled foreign agents. Critics were subtly defined as outsiders, destabilizers, tools of the West.
It wasn't about making people believe everything, but doubting everything else.
That's a very sharp way to put it. As one Russian political scientist observed, he restored not the Soviet Union, but the idea that Russia is never wrong. It was about creating an immunity to external criticism or alternative viewpoints.
Central to this was the vertical of power you mentioned earlier. This wasn't just about institutions, but about loyalty being the sole currency in the absence of ideology.
Absolutely. That phrase, "we must rebuild the vertical of power," sounded technocratic, but it was the core blueprint. The USSR relied on party discipline and ideological unity. Post-Soviet Russia had neither. So Putin built a structure based purely on loyalty. Obedience was rewarded. Unsanctioned initiative was dangerous. It wasn't just authoritarian, it was systemically loyalist.
Bringing the regions to heel was a key part of this.
Crucial. The chaotic 90s saw governors acting like local czars, own militias, foreign deals, defying Moscow. Putin ended that through administrative reform. Abolished direct gubernatorial elections. The president appointed governors subject to approval by Kremlin-aligned regional legislatures. The federal structure became a pyramid with Putin at the absolute apex.
Control wasn't enough. He needed predictability.
Yes, he installed his inner circle people from his St. Petersburg days, the FSB, old legal and trade networks, into key positions throughout the state apparatus. Not necessarily the most brilliant or innovative, but known quantities, reliably loyal.
Describe this loyalty vertical in practice.
Appointments based on trust, not expertise. Promotions for execution, not innovation. Responsibility flowed down, but authority flowed only up. If a school collapsed, the local mayor answered. If the mayor faltered, the governor answered. But the president remained untouched, above the fray. Accountability was strictly unidirectional.
And informal pressure was used too.
Constantly, surprise audits, leaked investigations targeting uncooperative officials, tax probes, conditional funding for regions. Every official understood their position depended on unspoken alignment with the Kremlin's wishes. Deviation didn't bring immediate punishment necessarily, but often just silence from above, a terrifying vulnerability in Putin's Russia.
So the system produced managers, not stars.
Exactly. Ambition became dangerous, discretion was rewarded. The result was a government that primarily administered, transmitting the Kremlin's will down and ensuring loyalty flowed back up. No real ideology, just continuity centered around the one figurehead nobody dared surprise.
Alongside building this loyal vertical, there was the silencing of dissent, but not always with dramatic force.
No, that was the key. The West perhaps expected a more overt crackdown, purges, show trials. But it came differently. Putin perfected the art of marginalizing dissent without necessarily creating martyrs. It was about discrediting, delegitimizing, pushing opponents to the absolute fringes, compartmentalizing opposition, not always crushing it outright.
Who was targeted first?
Political challengers. Liberal parties were fractured, often through internal manipulation or regulatory hurdles. The old communists faded. Nationalists were occasionally tolerated, then reabsorbed or sidelined. By 2003, the last truly independent parliamentary party, Yabloko, failed to pass the electoral threshold. New voting laws, redistricting, complex party registration rules, all ensured no meaningful opposition could gain momentum. By 2007, United Russia, Putin's vehicle of loyalty, held an overwhelming majority in the Duma. Elections became rituals, not contests.
Then the media.
Independent broadcasters were bought up, either directly by state companies or via Kremlin-linked proxies. Investigative journalists faced harassment, surveillance, and in some tragic cases like Anna Politkovskaya in 2006, were killed. No official link was ever proven in many cases, but the message was chillingly clear. Critique wasn't strictly illegal, but it certainly wasn't safe.
And civil society. NGOs.
Next on the list, NGOs receiving any foreign funding were labeled foreign agents, facing intense scrutiny and bureaucratic obstacles. New laws heavily restricted protests, confining them to approved zones and requiring complex permits. Activist leaders faced audits, detentions, smear campaigns, and state-controlled media.
The effect was cumulative, not explosive.
Exactly. It created a climate where speaking out was technically possible, but increasingly felt pointless or personally risky. You could blog, maybe protest with a single placard, hand out leaflets but often to empty streets, or an audience numbed by the dominant narrative.
Putin's innovation wasn't silencing everyone, but convincing the majority that no alternative voice truly mattered.
That seems to be the core of it. Not through overt terror, but through cultivating this logic of futility. As one dissident writer put it, "We are not censored, we are outnumbered."
By the end of his first term, Putin was this inescapable figure, yet remained personally unknowable. The mask that doesn't blink.
Absolutely. He was on TV daily, in meetings, at events, but the man himself remained opaque, rarely laughed, rarely raised his voice. His face, his sentences lacked flair or obvious emotion. Even when joking, his tone was cool. Even when issuing warnings, rarely visibly angry. Present but emotionally sealed.
It wasn't charisma, but control.
Total control. Western leaders noted how carefully he listened, his measured language. Never seemed to lose his train of thought. Never interrupted, rarely seemed to blink under pressure. They expected fire, found silence. Expected ideology, found strategy. He could praise reform in Brussels one day and defend a crackdown in Grozny the next. The voice remained consistent, seemingly without internal contradiction. Belief had long been disconnected from behavior.
He wasn't asking for trust, but obedience.
And speaking of Russia with gravity, not sentiment. We have risen from our knees, must not repeat the chaos of the 90s. Stability over speed. Simple, repeated lines meant to ground people, not necessarily inspire them.
And his inner circle mirrored this.
Completely. Press secretaries, advisors, ministers, and TET, they wore the same tempered blankness, spoke only when necessary, revealed little, rarely smiled in photos, rarely argued openly in meetings. It wasn't necessarily fear, more like profound alignment. A mood had become a system.
Opponents called it a regime, supporters, a disciplined government.
And the truth was perhaps that Putin himself, at the still center, was the ideology. Predictable, distant, unblinking, always watching.
Moving into his second term, the initial belief that Putin was just a temporary caretaker, a transitional figure, had clearly evaporated. Power was becoming permanent.
Yes, that early assumption completely missed the mark. He offered few signs, otherwise initially no grand doctrine, no immediate constitutional reshaping, just talk of recovery, stability, normalcy. But the first term revealed his true trajectory. He had no intention of stepping aside. By 2004, the landscape was transformed. No rivals with national support, no major TV outside Kremlin influence, no independent regional governors. He didn't declare absolute rule. He just became the only constant.
The March 2004 re-election was just confirmation.
Over 71% of the vote, no real doubt, no drama. His approval was consistently high, above 70%. Not universally loved, perhaps, but crucially, there was no credible alternative in the minds of most Russians. After the chaos, the mere absence of chaos felt like hope, or at least relief.
Outside observers were still misreading him, hoping for liberalization.
Many were. But Putin wasn't hiding anything. He just wasn't interested in pretending anymore. He didn't necessarily expand freedoms, but he didn't unnecessarily restrict them either, beyond what was needed for control. He made freedom procedural, optional, ultimately irrelevant to the functioning of power. The message became, you may speak, but power will not listen.
His power wasn't based on fear alone, but on this sense of permanence.
Exactly. The economic recovery, however oil-fueled, was real for many. Schools reopened, salaries were paid, cities were rebuilt. Putin became the fixed point. He didn't need to inspire, he just needed to end the freefall, which, in the eyes of many, he had done.
And the system calibrated itself to him.
Completely. Government ministers sought the president's preference, not just the letter of the law. Judges ruled cautiously, anticipating the desired outcome. TV anchors adopted his phrasing. Governors echoed his tone. Little needed to be explicitly stated. The system learned to respond to his silence, his perceived intentions. He became president by chance, perhaps, but he stayed by deliberate design.
The Yukos moment in October 2003 seems pivotal in cementing this permanence, particularly regarding the oligarchs. One arrest triggered widespread silence.
Absolutely pivotal. The early morning raid, the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then Russia's richest man, head of the Yukos oil giant, by FSB agents at Novosibirsk airport, flown to Moscow in handcuffs. Charges: tax evasion, fraud, embezzlement. But the underlying message was crystal clear. Money is not power. Only the state holds real power.
Khodorkovsky had pushed the boundaries.
He had. He built Yukos into a global energy player, spoke the language of international capital, invested in education, gave interviews to Western media, flirted with funding opposition parties, and even once publicly challenged Putin on corruption in a televised forum.
Putin's reaction at the time?
Minimal. A non-reaction. Then, less than a year later, the arrest. The court proceedings had the appearance of legality but lacked any real independence. Khodorkovsky was convicted, his company systematically dismantled, his prize assets auctioned off, primarily to state-aligned firms like Rosneft, which was under direct Kremlin control.
It wasn't just prosecution, it was a statement.
A public execution of oligarchic political autonomy and a de facto renationalization of strategic assets. And crucially, no other major arrests were needed. One man's fall was sufficient, the other oligarchs watched silently. Some fled Russia, others simply stopped challenging the Kremlin and fell into line. They kept their wealth, but they understood it was now conditional, granted by the state, not earned independently of it.
The Yukos affair wasn't just about oil, but about the sovereignty of the presidency.
Exactly. Putin was telling everyone, no matter how rich, famous, or seemingly indispensable, that no one was immune if they crossed the line into political opposition. It wasn't personal revenge, it was calibration. The elites recalibrated.
Right.
Western governments and corporations protested briefly, but rising energy prices and the continued flow of oil and gas meant business largely continued.
And the Russian public?
Barely stirred. Few mourned Khodorkovsky. Most viewed the oligarchs as predators who had looted the country in the 90s anyway. Putin's popularity probably grew. He had brought the untouchable to his knees. The new rule after Yukos was clear. Stay out of politics, praise the state, enjoy your fortune quietly. From then on, there was no doubt who governed Russia. Not the market, not the oligarchs, not the Duma, just one man and his fully commanded machine.
Alongside taming the oligarchs, Putin also focused on rewriting the narrative of the Chechen War, turning a national humiliation into a symbol of restored strength.
Yes, when Putin rose to power, Chechnya was this bleeding open wound. The first Chechen War under Yeltsin, 1994-96, had been a disaster, tens of thousands dead, the Russian army humiliated, ending with a fragile, unstable peace. For many Russians, Chechnya symbolized national weakness and the chaos of the Yeltsin era.
Putin understood a fractured state couldn't tolerate that.
He knew he had to resolve it, not just militarily, but to completely recast its meaning in the national imagination. The Second Chechen War, which began in late 1999, just as he became PM, was triggered officially by those apartment bombings blamed on Chechen separatists. This galvanized public opinion, allowing for an overwhelming military response.
And this war was presented differently.
Completely differently from Yeltsin's chaotic First War. Putin ensured it was television-friendly. Russian news showed order, precision, progress. Not the horrific reality of burning villages or mass graves, but flags, maps, strong decisive words from commanders, and always the calm, prepared image of Putin himself in control.
Despite the brutality on the ground, Grozny flattened.
Grozny was devastated by artillery and airstrikes. Thousands of civilians died. Journalists attempting independent reporting faced immense risks, disappearances, silencing. But the official narrative was unwavering. This wasn't brutality, it was stabilization. Putin was the unflinching commander restoring order.
And his blunt language, like the toilet quote.
To critics, it signaled authoritarian cruelty. But to millions of Russians yearning for strength after years of perceived weakness, it signaled a return to unapologetic self-defense, a leader willing to be tough. The pain of the war was overwritten by this carefully controlled retelling.
What was the final move in Chechnya?
Co-opting the region from within. Installing Ramzan Kadyrov, the son of a former rebel leader who had switched allegiance to Moscow as the head of the republic. Kadyrov proved brutally effective, flamboyant, and fiercely loyal to Putin personally.
In return.
Chechnya was pacified, but became this kind of extra-legal fiefdom governed by clan loyalty where human rights abuses were tolerated and lavish subsidies flowed from Moscow. It was no longer a rebellion, but a Kremlin satellite with teeth, kept in line by a loyal strongman.
So by the end of his first term, Putin had achieved the seemingly impossible regarding Chechnya.
He ended the active war, though not bringing lasting peace, more like enforced pressure. He retained control not through rebuilding democratic institutions, but by rewarding absolute loyalty. And crucially, he rewrote the narrative of loss, not by changing the facts on the ground necessarily, but by changing their meaning in the public consciousness. Chechnya was no longer a symbol of humiliation, but a symbol of the return of a state willing to be feared to avoid being ignored.
By the end of that first full term, then, Putin really stood alone. Not a traditional dictator yet, maybe, but alternatives had simply vanished.
That's the key point. Elections still happened, newspapers existed, parties were registered, but none of it truly mattered in terms of challenging his power. The opposition was fragmented, marginalized. Public figures who were once outspoken became cautious or silent. Television, the most trusted medium for most Russians, became essentially a one-script, one-actor stage reflecting the Kremlin's narrative.
There was no single consolidation moment, no coup.
No, just this steady, relentless erosion of competition. He was composed at press conferences, treated with respect at international summits, and completely undisputed at home. He didn't need to silence absolutely everyone, he just needed to ensure no one else could gain real momentum.
Potential challengers were absorbed, accused, or just became irrelevant.
Exactly. Political viability became tied to the question, why oppose him if he's irreplaceable? The West increasingly saw autocracy, but many in Russia felt relief. The 90s were chaos, Putin delivered coherence. Life wasn't suddenly luxurious for most, but salaries were being paid, borders felt secure, the national mood had stabilized somewhat.
And stability in a wounded society can transcend ideology.
Absolutely. Even critics started using terms like czar or strongman, implicitly acknowledging his unique position. But the quiet truth settling in Moscow was that Putin hadn't just imposed himself. He had filled a void that many felt was irreplaceable.
So by 2006, the question wasn't how long will Putin stay, but how could he possibly leave?
That shift in the fundamental question was crucial. It began reshaping the Constitution subtly, the elite's calculations, the public imagination. He started as perhaps an accidental president, but now Russia was being redesigned not just against chaos, but around one indispensable man.
Entering his second term around 2004 coincided with a massive surge in global oil prices. Perfect timing.
Incredible timing. Prices went from around $30 a barrel to peaking near $150 by 2008. Russia suddenly became incredibly wealthy, almost overnight, without needing major policy changes or innovations.
It wasn't innovation, just extraction.
Largely extraction on a national scale. Billions flowed into the treasury. This allowed for timely pension payments, raises for civil servants, funding for long-stalled infrastructure projects. A small but noticeable middle class began to grow, buying cars, traveling abroad, furnishing homes.
The memory of the 90s began to fade.
Replaced by a new feeling. Not necessarily hope or democracy, but dignity. The humiliation of the Soviet collapse lingered. Now, this unapologetic, raw, state-linked wealth became a substitute for a broader national revival.
Putin didn't flaunt it personally, but channeled it.
Yes. Sovereign wealth funds were created, new gas pipelines to Europe and China were constructed, major trade deals signed, foreign debt paid down. Russia began reasserting its influence financially and politically. The simple truth underpinning it all was Russia no longer felt it needed the West in the same way. It could afford to have its own voice, its own path.
This wasn't just economic, but psychological.
A huge psychological shift.
Hmm.
And you heard it in Putin's tone. Still measured, still formal, but less conciliatory towards the West.
The 2007 Munich Security Conference speech was a key moment.
A stunning moment for the Western attendees. He declared the unipolar world was over, called NATO expansion a provocation, stated Russia had its own interests and would defend them. It wasn't bluster, it was a declaration of return fueled by oil money and renewed confidence.
And inside Russia, the narrative was,
The state works again. The world must respect us. Our president is the reason. Putin didn't seek adoration, necessarily, but something more lasting. The public tying their stability, their income, their sense of global relevance directly to his continued presence. By the end of his second term, he wasn't just popular, he seemed essential, not because of ideology, but because of oil, order, and the perceived absence of any better options.
alongside the oil boom, the concept of managed democracy became central to maintaining control. Elections happened, but the outcomes were never really in doubt.
Right. Outwardly, Russia in the 2000s looked somewhat democratic. Scheduled elections, multiple parties, newspapers, candidates, even debates. But the result was always certain. Managed democracy was the term coined, reportedly by Kremlin-linked political technologists like Vladislav Surkov. They understood that the illusion of democratic process could provide more stability than outright suppression.
So not canceling elections, but curating them.
Exactly. Not silencing all opposition, but designing it. The mechanism involved ensuring only non-threatening parties could freely campaign. Major TV networks were either state-controlled or owned by loyal oligarchs, shaping the narrative. Election laws tightened requirements for candidates and parties, making it harder for genuine outsiders to get on the ballot. Local officials were incentivized, often heavily, to deliver high turnout and predictable large majorities for the ruling party.
Was there outright fraud?
It certainly existed when needed, particularly at the regional level. But often the illusion of choice, combined with the lack of compelling alternatives and the control of the media narrative, was enough. Voters didn't necessarily believe deeply in the system, but they came to expect its predictable outcomes, which, paradoxically, strengthened it.
Putin himself didn't campaign like a typical politician.
No, he presided. He appeared at factories, military bases, hospitals. He never debated opponents he didn't need to. He was less a candidate, more a national fixture. The sentiment was often, you may not love him, but at least we know what we're getting. It was about predictable consent, not necessarily enthusiasm or fear.
Even the allowed opposition served a purpose.
Yes, the Communist Party, the nationalist LDPR, they were allowed minor representation, acting as a kind of controlled opposition, giving a veneer of pluralism. Liberal reformers might get some airtime, but were consistently framed as weak, fragmented, or beholden to foreign interests.
Only genuine threats faced real risk.
Journalists, activists, business leaders with independent influence, they were the ones who faced repression, often through procedural means like tax audits or spurious legal charges, rather than dramatic arrests. Putin's genius, in a way, was not outlawing politics, but making all political roads lead back to him. Even disagreement became a controlled variable, as one Western analyst put it, a democracy designed by a former intelligence officer, where everything is legal and nothing is free.
This period also saw a distinct shift in foreign policy. Putin was no longer seeking to join the Western order, but demanding recognition of Russia's sovereignty.
That's a crucial shift. The first term hinted at integration G8 membership, seeking foreign investment, attending summits. But the second term, especially fueled by that oil wealth, saw a change in tone. It wasn't about integration anymore, it was about recognition. Not partnership on Western terms, but sovereignty on Russian terms.
The core idea wasn't destroying the West, but making it understand Russia wouldn't take orders.
Precisely. The turning point, again, was that 2007 Munich speech. It stunned Western diplomats. Unipolar world over. NATO expansion provocation. What is a sovereign democracy, if not one answering only to itself? It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of independence from what he saw as Western lectures, prescriptions, and the post-1991 notion that Russia had to somehow earn its place back at the table. In Putin's view, Russia had helped build that table.
Russian foreign policy became more assertive.
Yes, more assertive in the former Soviet republics, viewing them as Russia's sphere of influence. Defensively rhetorical towards the West. but increasingly willing to act preemptively and unapologetic about using hard power when deemed necessary.
Which led to the 2008 Georgia War.
That was the moment the shift turned kinetic. Georgia was moving closer to NATO. Russia intervened militarily, citing the need to protect Russian citizens in the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It was a brief war, but the message was lasting and aimed far beyond Georgia. There are red lines. Russia will define them, and Russia will enforce them. It was about rewriting the rules of post-Cold War diplomacy.
Putin saw NATO expansion and the color revolutions not as democracy spreading, but as Western intrusion.
Exactly. He viewed the decade of NATO moving eastward, the EU expanding into former Soviet spheres, and revolutions toppling pro-Russian governments in places like Georgia and Ukraine, not as organic democratic movements, but as coordinated Western efforts to contain and humiliate Russia.
And now, with oil money, military confidence, and domestic control, he felt he had the tools to push back.
Yes. Russian foreign policy became increasingly transactional, strategic, and even theatrical. Natural gas became a geopolitical lever. Russian state media expanded its international reach. Disinformation was employed more overtly as a tool of statecraft. The Kremlin no longer sought approval, it sought leverage, making itself unignorable. Putin didn't want the West's love. He wanted to be factored into every equation, just as the Soviet Union had been.
By the late 2000s, Putin's public image had solidified into this paradox. Everywhere, yet somehow above it all. The cult of control, not personality.
That's a great way to describe it. He was constantly on TV, in meetings, his image on billboards, yet he remained distant, almost impersonal. He didn't seem to crave admiration in the way some leaders do. He projected no grand ideology or transformative vision. What he offered was more enduring, perhaps: stability, predictability, control.
And the Kremlin media nurtured this image carefully.
Very carefully. Those images of him fishing, flying with cranes, playing hockey, shirtless in Siberia, they weren't meant to be funny. They were symbols of vitality, strength, connection to the land, being above the fray of normal politics.
The anti-politician.
In many ways, not talkative, not theatrical. He didn't inspire passionate love, but a kind of certainty. Even his perceived coldness appealed to some Russians weary of the emotional roller coaster of the 90s. He doesn't lie because he doesn't tell us anything. It felt almost refreshing.
It wasn't worship, but narrative discipline.
Yes, every success, economic, diplomatic, military, was linked directly to his decisiveness. Every crisis was blamed on external forces or internal enemies, contained only by his vigilance. Even setbacks were often spun to serve him critics' deaths, framed as provocations, protests as Western meddling, Western condemnation as proof of Russia's strength.
His distance made him untouchable.
And his indifference felt strategic. It wasn't populism in the usual sense, but a kind of managerial mythology. Putin, as the one who knew things others didn't, saw threats others missed, acted preemptively while others dithered. No grand speeches needed, just signals. No fury, just outcomes.
Even tragedies like the Beslan school siege or the Kursk submarine disaster were framed differently.
Framed not as leadership failures, but as unavoidable costs in a dangerous world. He offered containment, not necessarily healing or accountability. Over time, this control extended even to the perception of time itself. Life after Putin began to feel irrelevant, even dangerous to contemplate. Potential successors were tested, rotated, but none were allowed to become too visible or build an independent power base.
So as 2008 approached, the end of his second consecutive term, the question wasn't if he would retain power, but how.
Exactly. How could the country possibly continue if he didn't, in some form? That marked the arrival of something new. Not just a president, but a principle of governance embodied in one person.
The 2008 constitutional limit of 2 consecutive terms presented a challenge. Putin had immense popularity, unchallenged power. He could have tried to force a change.
He could have, but he didn't, not directly. Instead, came this surprising move. He named Dmitry Medvedev a mild-mannered St. Petersburg technocrat, a lawyer, loyal, seen as non-threatening as his preferred successor.
Medvedev ran, won easily, and immediately appointed Putin as prime minister.
The message was unmistakable. We're trading seats, not power. It was the first time in modern Russian history the presidency had been voluntarily passed on. Yet within months, it was crystal clear Putin hadn't actually left, he'd just shifted form.
He still acted like the man in charge.
He chaired major meetings, addressed the nation on key issues, traveled internationally almost like a head of state, issued instructions that carried the weight of presidential orders.
Medvedev held the title. Putin held the system.
They called it the tandem, or castling. In practice, it was rule by remote control. The Siloviki, the regional governors, foreign leaders, Everyone knew who to really defer to. The public still spoke of Putin as if he'd never gone.
It was a masterstroke in a way.
It preserved constitutional legitimacy, avoided accusations of outright dictatorship, gave the illusion of pluralism, and powerfully demonstrated that his control transcended any specific job title.
Medvedev was allowed some symbolic
A
liberalism.
little talk of modernization, some engagement with the West, minor reforms, but no major shifts in policy occurred. Everyone understood he was keeping the seat warm.
Until 2011, when they announced the swap back.
Yes, nearing the end of Medvedev's term, they publicly announced Medvedev wouldn't seek re-election and Putin would return to the presidency in 2012. The cycle was complete. There was no major outcry. The system was prepared for. Putin had proved a deeper truth. Power, once fully internalized by a system, no longer needs a specific job title. It becomes the system.
But Putin's planned return sparked something unexpected. The December 2011 parliamentary elections, though resulting in a united Russia victory, triggered protests.
Yes, that time felt different. Videos started emerging, blatant ballot stuffing, rewritten vote totals, bust-in voters. In the past, maybe it would have been ignored or dismissed more easily. But now, smartphones and social media allow this evidence to spread rapidly. The fatigue with the managed rituals hardened into genuine anger for a significant segment of the population, particularly in big cities.
Tens of thousands protested in Moscow, St. Petersburg.
The largest protest since the collapse of the Soviet Union. People wore white ribbons as symbols of protest. Placards read, "Russia without Putin, down with the party of crooks and thieves, we exist." The chants felt almost existential, demanding to be seen, not just surveyed or managed.
How did Putin, still prime minister then, react?
With contempt, not concern. He publicly mocked the white ribbons. It was a smirk that perhaps masked a deeper unease. He wasn't used to being the target of public ridicule on this scale.
His return to the presidency, announced months earlier, had felt inevitable. But these protests changed the mood.
For a growing, urban, educated, digitally connected group of Russians, it felt like a curtain had been pulled back. The feeling was, we weren't just voting anymore. We were being told that our votes simply didn't matter.
Kremlin loyalists dismissed the protests.
As foreign-backed, elite-driven, irrelevant. But inside Putin's system, a signal had undoubtedly been received. The implicit compact order in exchange for public passivity had expired for some. The new threat wasn't revolution, perhaps, but disillusionment.
Putin still won the presidency again in March 2012.
Yes, with around 63%. But the victory felt different. Less triumphant, less romanticized, more efficient, perhaps. But behind it, a sense that the nation was subtly shifting, that the old equilibrium was disturbed.
Putin's return to the presidency in 2012, after those protests, marked a shift to a harder tone, both domestically and internationally.
Definitely. The victory felt smaller, the streets had spoken, the mask of universal support had visibly cracked, even if only partially. The Kremlin's response was swift, not panicked, but a clear adjustment. If the public, or parts of it, were questioning the system would respond with power, not persuasion.
How did this manifest domestically?
In layers. New laws severely restricting protests, more NGOs labeled foreign agents and squeezed out of operation, increased internet surveillance, a more overtly patriotic school curriculum. The Duma became even more of a rubber stamp for presidential initiatives. Everything remained technically legal, but the space for dissent tightened considerably.
Putin's public rhetoric changed too.
Yes. Less talk of modernization, more emphasis on traditional values, morality. Less talk of partnership with the West, more warnings about foreign interference. Less technocratic language, more historical, national, almost civilizational framing. Phrases like, they try to teach us democracy, but we have our own traditions. Or, Russia has risen from its knees and won't be brought to heel.
It wasn't just politics, but reframing identity.
Exactly. The liberal class was increasingly painted as a fifth column. Protesters were depicted as tools of the West. Opposition figures became enemies of Russian sovereignty. The message was simple and stark. If you're not with stability, you're with chaos. Questioning the center threatens the nation itself.
And a harder tone abroad as well.
Yes. The Kremlin viewed the Arab Spring uprisings, often supported by the U.S. and EU, not as democratic movements, but as dangerous destabilization. NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011 seemed to confirm a long-held suspicion in Moscow. The West doesn't care about order. It only cares about obedience to its own model.
So the 2011-12 protests triggered a deeper shift.
Deeper than just policy changes. It seemed to restore and reinforce Putin's long-used binary worldview. Us versus them. Stability versus surrender. Loyalty versus infiltration. Once that framework was firmly back in place, Putin increasingly stopped negotiating. He started declaring.
This harder line, this focus on sovereignty and perceived Western encroachment culminated dramatically in Crimea in 2014. History wasn't just revisited, it was actively reclaimed.
Absolutely. February 2014, Kyiv was burning. The Moscow-aligned, widely seen as corrupt, President Yanukovych fled after the Maidan Revolution, which clearly signaled Ukraine turning towards the West. Putin viewed this not as a democratic uprising, but as a Western-backed coup designed to pull Ukraine definitively out of Moscow's sphere of influence.
The response was swift and surgical.
Incredibly swift. Within days, masked, unmarked soldiers, the infamous Little Green Men, appeared across Crimea, seizing airports, parliament buildings. Russian flags started appearing everywhere. Putin initially denied direct Russian involvement, claiming they were local self-defense forces.
But it was pure choreography.
Textbook. A Moscow-loyal government was quickly installed in Crimea. A referendum on joining Russia was announced within 2 weeks. Ballots printed, distributed, collected, all under the watchful eye of those unmarked Russian troops. Officially, 97% supposedly voted to join Russia. No independent observers, no international recognition, but plenty of cameras capturing the staged events.
Then Putin's annexation announcement on March 18, 2014.
A televised address. The tone wasn't cautious anymore. It was historic, emotional, defiant. Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia. People were separated against their will. Today, we are correcting a historical injustice.
The message to the world.
Unmistakable. Russia is back. Borders are not sacred. History is not closed. Force is, once again, a legitimate political tool in the right hands, according to Moscow.
The West responded with sanctions. Russia responded with
celebration. Putin's approval rating soared past 80% domestically. Crimea became instantly enshrined as a national myth. The return of greatness, the righting of past humiliations, proof that Putin protects what others supposedly gave away or lost. Critics saw a blatant violation of international law. Putin presented it as destiny fulfilled.
The Western sanctions imposed after Crimea were significant, aiming to isolate Russia and force a climb down. But that didn't happen. Instead, Russia seemed to embrace isolation as a form of self-reliance.
That's exactly right. The sanctions were swift and comprehensive condemnation. Suspension from the G8, asset freezes on officials, diplomatic walkouts. The West saw a clear red line crossed. Russia, or at least the Kremlin, saw a line they had never agreed to in the first place.
The sanctions were severe.
Banks cut off, officials banned from travel, European contracts frozen, restrictions on oil and gas technology. It was the most significant coordinated backlash since the Cold War, aimed squarely at making Putin feel the cost.
But the climb down never came.
Never. Russia adapted, or at least performed adaptation. Retaliatory import bans were imposed: no more French cheese, German pork, Polish apples. Import substitution became a national slogan. Resilience itself became a form of political theater, valued perhaps more than actual economic efficiency or prosperity.
How did the Kremlin frame the sanctions internally?
Predictably, as proof of Western hostility. They fear us. They want to keep us weak. They can't accept Russia's independence. And for many Russians, this narrative resonated. The world's rejection felt familiar. Generations had been raised on stories of betrayal, encirclement, collapse. Being an outcast almost felt like a confirmation of Russian uniqueness and strength.
But the isolation was costly in real terms.
Immensely costly. The ruble plunged and never fully recovered its previous value. Inflation surged. Factory parts became scarce. Access to Western medicines became harder. Energy exports lost some long-term buyers. And the brain drain educated professionals leaving the country accelerated significantly.
And beneath the surface, fear returned.
A chilling effect spread. Teachers were warned about what to say. New fake news laws criminalized dissent, however vaguely defined. Protesters were jailed for minor infractions. Children were sometimes questioned about their parents' views. The state became increasingly suspicious of its own population.
Yet Putin didn't waver.
No. The siege mentality is a space he understands, perhaps even thrives in. A surrounded Russia obeys. A punished Russia rallies. An abandoned Russia, in his view, needs only one voice: his.
This post-Crimea period saw the consolidation of what's been called Fortress Russia, not just turning inward, but institutionalizing that isolation.
Yes. The Kremlin largely stopped pretending alignment with Western norms or aspirations. A new framework was constructed, built on sovereignty, suspicion, and strength. It wasn't just policy, it became a national psychology. We are alone, we always have been, and that is our power.
How did this play out domestically?
New media laws tightened state control further. School history lessons emphasized Russia as a perpetual survivor state, besieged but resilient. Independent NGOs were effectively shut down or severely curtailed as foreign agents. Critical cultural figures were sidelined, defunded, sometimes pushed into exile. Loyalty wasn't just preferred, it was increasingly expected.
Russia wasn't collapsing, but tightening.
Exactly. The result was this fortress-like political theater. Outside, a hostile world besieging a unique civilization. Inside, the indispensable leader at the center, holding it all together.
Foreign policy mirrored this?
Completely. If the West wanted division, Russia supported populist or anti-establishment movements abroad. If NATO spoke of security, Russia tested borders with military exercises or flybys. If critics demanded restraint, Russia acted boldly, often with deliberate ambiguity.
From Crimea to Syria, election interference, the Salisbury poisonings.
A new pattern emerged. Russia wasn't aiming to be trusted anymore, but to be feared, respected, and above all, never ignored.
Fortress Russia became more than a metaphor.
It became a worldview. Weakness invites collapse. Transparency invites sabotage. Cooperation is only safe when tightly controlled. Western promises are merely tools of infiltration. Putin didn't invent these ideas entirely, but he amplified them, tapping into deep currents in Russian history and psychology. He articulated what many perhaps felt since 1991. We don't need the outside world's approval. We are the world on our own terms. Russia became something unique, not cleanly post-Soviet, not fully authoritarian in the old mold, not democratic, but a fortress wrapped in memory, armed with narrative, ruled by a man who never needed to shout to be noticed.
By 2018, Putin secured re-election for his fourth term overall, the second since his 2012 return. The outcome was predictable, the ceremony elaborate, but the question of the constitutional term limit in 2024 lingered.
Yes, over 76% of the vote, no real opposition allowed to run effectively. Navalny barred, others just placeholders. But that two-consecutive term limit was the elephant in the room.
The answer came in 2020, amidst the pandemic.
Constitutional reforms were proposed by the Duma. They covered a wide range defining marriage, pension guarantees, even mentioning God. But buried within was the crucial clause, one that effectively reset the presidential term count for the incumbent. All previous terms were nullified, allowing Putin to run again in 2024 and 2030 as if starting anew.
How is this presented?
As a popular vote on updating the Constitution for the modern era. The process itself was opaque, rushed, heavily managed by the state. State TV celebrated it, opposition voices were silenced or banned from campaigning against it. Turnout was encouraged with incentives, sometimes pressure.
The result?
Official figures claimed over 77% approval. Critics called it a constitutional coup. Supporters hailed it as ensuring continuity. Putin himself barely commented publicly. He didn't need to. The gesture was complete. He wasn't declared leader for life, but his expiration date was effectively removed.
It wasn't just about elections anymore, but shaping time itself.
He was no longer just a figure in Russian history. He was positioning himself as its central axis. There was private grumbling among the elite, the lack of a succession plan, the system's utter dependence on one man, but public silence was maintained, partly because their own stability was tied to his. Putin had achieved something rare. The presidency transformed from a position into a condition. Not 4 more years, but just more years, until further notice or his decision.
This prolonged rule by one person inevitably leads to a kind of institutional memory loss, doesn't it? The system's ability to act independently atrophies.
It's a profound consequence. The Russian Federation still has all the structures of a modern state, ministries, parliament, courts. But by the 2020s, they increasingly functioned as transmission belts for signals, directives, and sometimes just anticipated preferences emanating from the presidency.
Laws and debates still happen, but the mechanism is thinned out.
Thinned by the central truth. Nothing truly important happens without some connection to Putin, explicit or implicit. Not necessarily because he micromanages everything, but because the entire system learned to act as if he does. Bureaucrats stole decisions waiting for a signal, governors mimic his rhetoric, judges rule according to anticipated Kremlin preferences. Loyalty replaced initiative, survival replaced ambition. Governing became a form of mimicry.
People rise based on discretion, risk avoidance, echoing the leader.
And crucially, by never appearing as a potential successor, meritocracy erodes. The paradox is, the longer Putin rules, the less the state seems capable of even imagining alternative leadership. Not because alternatives are always brutally crushed, though sometimes they are, but because they cease to even form in a meaningful way.
A whole generation knows only this reality.
An entire cohort of officials, journalists, voters came of age knowing only this version of Russia. Tense, vertical, centralized, reactive, self-contained. Change itself starts to feel dangerous, almost threatening to their sense of identity and stability.
Even the elite think in his grammar.
Crises trigger the question, what will he do? His actions instantly reorganize the system's priorities. There's little room for independent planning, for challenging assumptions, for thinking about after, because after has become almost unthinkable, unspeakable. It's both the genius and the fatal flaw of the permanent state, seemingly indestructible in the present, but incredibly inflexible and unprepared for the future. The man adapts, perhaps, but the machine forgets how to function any other way.
Alongside the institutional effects, the myth becomes the man. Enduring power stems from belief, not just affection or fear.
Absolutely. Every strong man uses fear, but few master myths so effectively. By the late 2010s and into the 2020s, Putin's presence saturated Russian life through constant narrative repetition, not necessarily through overt rallies or demanding slogans like in older personality cults.
How is the myth constructed?
Textbooks portrayed him as the savior of the state from 90s chaos. News programs attributed all stability to him. Documentaries painted him as a wise strategist misunderstood by a hostile West. The official timeline of modern Russia became his biography, the quiet force who restored the nation.
Even failures were reabsorbed into the narrative.
Yes, sanctions proved the West's fear and Russia's resilience. Isolation became proof of independence. Protests were evidence of Western meddling requiring vigilance. The lack of alternatives demonstrated national unity under his leadership. The recurring message, times are hard, yes, but imagine how much worse it would be without him.
State-commissioned films, biographies emphasizing discipline, martial arts, loyalty.
Stage-managed interviews presenting him as both father figure and warrior, stoic, knowing, distant, yet omnipresent. Carefully curated public appearances, often in nature with animals, not presenting him as a mere politician, but something above politics.
It wasn't a spectacular cult, but a subtler myth of certainty.
Certainty, unflappability, the absence of chaos. He didn't demand devotion. He cultivated dependence. The effect was powerful. Even critics often started their arguments with, well, Putin is smart, but the state doesn't need universal love. It needs the population to struggle to imagine life without the leader. That's the essence of modern political myth.
Yeah.
Plausible inevitability, not just crude propaganda. In a country with rewritten history and contested memory, Putin became the face point, not by never changing, but by never appearing weak. He doesn't just dominate the narrative. He is the narrative.
By the early 2020s, Putin had ruled longer than Brezhnev, longer than Stalin before the purges truly took hold, longer than any other living European head of state. He had outlasted presidents, witnessed global shifts, rewritten the constitution, rebuilt the military, rebranded the nation. He was beyond the peak, perhaps.
That's a complex question. He's certainly reached an extraordinary level of sustained power. Yet the feeling wasn't one of continued ascent or dynamism, but perhaps endurance, maybe even stagnation. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air. His reign, particularly in later years, wasn't marked by innovation. The economy remained heavily reliant on resource extraction, youth immigration continued, corruption felt normalized, repression became habitual, presented as strength, but perhaps masking insecurity.
The myth holds, but the machine groans.
Something like that. Loyalty feels increasingly transactional, based on fear of the vacuum his absence would create. The elite are compliant because their wealth and status are tied to the state he controls. Bureaucrats echo because initiative is punished. The system tightens almost from inertia, not necessarily renewed discipline. No one truly believes he'll fall, but perhaps fewer believe the country under him will genuinely grow or evolve positively.
And abroad.
A reflexive rejection of global norms. Defiance itself becomes the identity, rather than seeking to build a new world order. Putin remained highly visible, but perhaps less surprising, his actions more predictable in their disruptiveness.
Public fatigue creeps in.
Not open rebellion necessarily, but maybe a spreading sense of emptiness, of a pre-written future with a thinning script. The myth still functions, but it seems to require more constant repetition, more vigilance, more enforcement. A believed myth has to be protected from competing memories or inconvenient facts. Ruling beyond the peak means no longer rising, but holding the summit in place not for glory, but because everything below assumes you won't or can't let go.
Which leads to the ultimate question for this kind of system, the exit that never comes, perpetuating power by never defining its limits.
Every empire, every long ruling leader fears that question. What happens after? And in Putin's Russia, the answer has been intentionally left blank. Since his 2012 return, there's been no clearly named successor, no deputy with independent authority, no anointed political heir, no tolerated internal opposition that could realistically take over.
This isn't an oversight, but a strategy.
It appears to be. Naming a successor invites speculation, signals potential decline, creates rival power centers. Instead, Putin exists in this state of suspended permanence, presented not just as a man holding an office, but as a national necessity.
Officials worry privately, but saying it is taboo.
Because preparing for a post-Putin era suggests that such an era is imaginable, which undermines the very basis of the current system's stability. The problem isn't just his refusal to leave, it's that there's no viable mechanism for him to leave, even if he wanted to. The institutions are too weakened, potential alternatives too fragile, the state itself too fused to his personal image and control. Leaving would risk collapsing the entire architecture he spent 2 decades building.
The paradox. The longer he stays, the more dangerous it becomes for him and the system for him to leave.
Precisely. So he stays driven by will, perceived necessity, fear, deliberate design. The only exit seems to be the one nobody dares to open or even contemplate publicly. Yet time moves on. Putin gets older, his original inner circle shrinks, the world changes faster than the fortress can always adapt. No system lasts forever. But denying the possibility of change makes the eventual transition, whenever and however it comes, potentially unmanageable. No breaks, no clear succession, no collective memory of another way to function, just a long wait for an ending that feels increasingly uncontrollable.
This culminated tragically in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. A road many saw being paved, yet the final step still shocked the world.
It was foreseeable in retrospect, yet many remained unconvinced right up until the end. The massive Russian troop buildup was happening in plain sight, but the Kremlin repeatedly denied any invasion plans, calling them routine exercises. People remember 2014 Crimea, Donbass, the Little Green Men, but a full-scale assault seemed like a different order of magnitude.
The rhetoric had hardened significantly in the preceding months.
Yes. Claims that Ukraine wasn't a real country, that NATO posed an existential threat, that the West had betrayed promises, that Russian speakers were being oppressed. Then came the February 21st televised address recognizing the separatist republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. A familiar playbook, it seemed.
But what followed wasn't.
February 24th, pre-dawn. Putin appears on TV again, calm, expressionless, announcing a special military operation. The stated goals: demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, protecting Russian speakers, preventing further NATO expansion. Minutes later, missiles struck Kharkiv, targets across Ukraine. Tanks rolled over the borders. It was real, total, undeniably war.
The world was stunned, expecting maybe a limited incursion, not this.
Yet for Putin, this seemed years in the making. Not necessarily because Ukraine's actions fundamentally changed, but because he had changed, or his calculations had. Understanding the invasion requires trying to understand his mindset, his deeply held beliefs, however contested. Perhaps not just expanding territory, but restoring perceived historical unity. Not just provoking NATO, but averting national humiliation. Not just waging war, but cementing his own legacy.
It felt like mythological arithmetic, not just strategy.
Crimea had perhaps made him feel invincible. The West, a confirmed adversary. Maybe only Ukraine, all of it, could complete the historical narrative he felt compelled to write. An immense gamble, with costs and consequences spiraling far beyond initial expectations. The fuse was lit, and there would be no quiet afterward.
The global reaction was immediate and severe. The world closed in, imposing unprecedented sanctions. Isolation became a direct consequence of action, not just a pre-existing condition.
Absolutely. March 2022 saw a cascade of responses. Embassies shuttered, flights grounded, Russian banks frozen out of international systems, athletes barred from competitions, oligarch assets seized, technology transfers restricted, state media like RT banned in many countries. Within weeks, Russia faced the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. SWIFT access revoked for key banks, Visa and MasterCard suspended operations, major Western brands, McDonald's, Apple, BP, IKEA pulled out. Visible symbols of globalization vanished almost overnight.
Did Russian society collapse under this pressure?
No, it didn't collapse, but it shrank rapidly, both materially and psychologically. The Kremlin's response was predictable, almost rehearsed. Claims of Russophobia, framing the sanctions as economic warfare. The narrative sharpened instantly. This isn't really about Ukraine, it's about destroying Russia. Putin himself called the sanctions a form of hybrid war, political, economic, cultural, digital. In his view, the West had always planned this. The invasion was just the pretext they needed.
And for many Russians, that story worked.
It resonated, tapping into those familiar feelings of encirclement and betrayal. Being cast out by the world again felt, perversely, like a confirmation of Russia's unique path and the West's inherent hostility.
But the real costs mounted.
Immense costs. The ruble's instability, surging inflation, shortages of parts and medicines, loss of energy markets, the accelerating brain drain. And internally, that chilling effect intensified the fake news laws, the arrest for dissent, the pervasive fear. The state became suspicious of everyone.
Still, Putin didn't
The
waver.
siege mentality kicked in fully. A surrounded Russia obeys. A punished Russia rallies. An abandoned Russia needs only one voice.
The invasion, initially presented as a swift special military operation, dragged on. This led to the partial mobilization in September 2022, bringing the true weight of the war home to ordinary Russians.
Yes, the illusion of a quick, distant conflict cracked. After months of mounting casualties and stalled advances, the Kremlin announced the first partial mobilization since World War II. Hundreds of thousands were supposed to be called up. Suddenly, recruiters were active, draft offices were busy, and panic spread among parts of the population.
Tens of thousands fled the country.
Yes, flights sold out, border crossings became clogged. For a generation largely unfamiliar with mass warfare, the abstract myth of national defense became terrifyingly real and personal. The war was no longer just a spectacle on state TV. It was the neighbor's son killed at the front, the haunted man limping in the grocery line, factories retooled for military production, the family budget squeezed, the dreaded arrival of official death notices.
How did the state adapt its narrative?
Putin framed mobilization as a civilizational duty. Russia wasn't just fighting Ukraine anymore. It was fighting the collective West, its culture, its expansionism, its ideology. The stakes were raised from defending sovereignty to ensuring national survival itself.
War machine expanded.
Soviet-style emphasis on military output returned. Wartime patriotism was mandated in schools. The Orthodox Church declared the war righteous. Media relentlessly framed losses as heroic sacrifices and battlefield setbacks as temporary difficulties on the road to inevitable victory. It wasn't just mobilization of troops, it was the nationalization of the narrative.
Even the language changed.
Officially, it remained the special military operation. Terms like liberation or defense of the Russian world were mandated. Saying war or criticizing the military became illegal, punishable by hefty prison sentences. Citizens were expected not just to comply, but to perform alignment, to demonstrate loyalty.
Putin himself rarely seemed rattled publicly.
But each decree, each escalation, each tightening of control perhaps hinted at an unspeakable truth. The war could not be allowed to be lost because loss would mean the collapse of everything he had built over 2 decades. The initial show of strength had become a point of no return.
This created a war within Russia itself, not just on the battlefield in Ukraine. A war fought with suspicion, repression, and rituals of obedience.
That's exactly. By early 2023, the conflict's impact permeated everyday life. Schools weren't just teaching subjects, they were holding patriotic lessons, encouraging reporting of anti-war sentiment, using redrawn maps showing occupied territories as forever Russia, teaching a revised history.
The workplace changed. Home life.
Certain topics became taboo in the workplace. Social media was monitored more closely. Expressing dissent carried real risks. At home, hushed arguments erupted, generational splits widened, a pervasive fear settled over many conversations.
The new laws about discrediting the armed forces were key.
Their vagueness was their power. A social media post, a question asked in a classroom, holding a blank banner, even a perceived slip of the tongue could lead to arrest and significant prison sentences. The real weapon wasn't always overt violence, but uncertainty. Nobody knew precisely where the line was, so most retreated far behind it, self-censoring.
It wasn't Stalinist terror, but a pervasive chilling effect.
A growing awareness that speech carried risk, while silence offered survival. The war forced citizens who had previously tried to stay out of politics to live within it constantly, every phone call, every online comment, every glance potentially scrutinized.
Yet no mass uprising occurred.
Just a deeper retreat into private life for many, while public life was stripped of spontaneity and unpredictability. For the Kremlin, this might look like proof of control. For the people living it, it felt like life under glass. Putin had mobilized not only an army, but fear itself, not always through visible violence, but through its ever-present possibility. The war within wasn't meant to be won. It was meant to keep people focused on survival, too preoccupied or too afraid to challenge the status quo.
2 years into the invasion, the lines blurred completely. War became politics, statecraft became storytelling. The conflict seemed to settle into a forever war dynamic.
Yes, the special military operation framing war thin, even internally, though it remained the official term. Everyone knew it was a grinding, attritional war with no clear end in sight. Russia controlled significant Ukrainian territory on paper, but was trapped in this slow, costly campaign. Villages lost and retaken, endless troop rotations, the slow bleed of sanctions, the steady flow of Western weapons to Ukraine, the mounting, often hidden, casualties. The front line shifted incrementally, but never decisively resolved.
Moscow appeared to have no viable exit strategy.
It seemed impossible. The war was no longer just about land. It had become existential, about the very meaning of Putin's rule and Russia's place in the world. To stop fighting without a clear victory would be to admit a catastrophic miscalculation. To withdraw would shatter the carefully constructed myth of restored greatness. To actually lose would risk undoing 2 decades of carefully crafted national identity built around Putin's strength.
So the war continues, not until victory, but until further notice.
That became the logic of the forever conflict. It justifies domestic repression, explains economic hardship, silences opposition, freezes political time, and binds Putin inextricably to the narrative of the protector, the restorer, the essential leader at war. The war started to define the man perhaps more than the man defined the war.
The elite grew quieter.
Whether through conviction, calculation, or fear. No one knew the end game, and no one dared ask too loudly.
And the people adapted.
Flag waving, closing curtains, praying, emigrating if possible. That familiar rhythm returned. State pronouncement, military action, enforced silence, followed by a new, grimmer normal. What happens to a country built around an unwinnable war? The answer seems to be in drift, not explosion. A generation grows up in the fog of conflict, peace becomes a forgotten concept, and the leader stays in place partly because there is no conceivable peace for him to step back into. The forever conflict survives not by winning or losing, but simply by never ending.
So, looking back at this entire trajectory, from the Leningrad courtyards to the Kremlin and the current war, what remains? What will Putin's legacy truly be? It's history that assigns legacies, not the leader themselves.
That's the crucial point. Legacies are determined by the future, rarely successfully claimed in the present. Putin has certainly attempted to write his own shaping laws, manipulating memory, controlling politics and narrative, erasing opponents, building the system where the state and his personas seem merged. But ultimately, he can control power, perhaps, but not memory itself, not in the long run.
What remains tangible?
A Russia that is no longer chaotic like the 90s, but also isn't evolving or truly dynamic. No longer collapsing, certainly, but far from a free or open society. The myth of restored greatness still functions for many, but it requires constant reinforcement and increasingly silence to maintain.
He promised restored dignity. Did he deliver?
Millions believe he did, ending the shame of the 90s, standing up to the West, returning Crimea, building an unbowing nation. But arguably, the power structure he built claimed that dignity primarily for itself, for the state, and ultimately froze it through war and repression.
There's no Yeltsin moment waiting, no graceful exit planned.
It seems impossible under the current structure. The system appears incapable of changing course without him, yet arguably incapable of genuine growth with him. That's the core paradox he leaves. Stability without renewal, perceived strength without a clear future, a kind of trembling permanence. What remains is also a map of scars across Ukraine, Georgia, among the exiles, the political prisoners, the silenced voices, the generation raised under obedience. And perhaps that enduring image, the man alone at the long table, a leader who couldn't leave because everything was built on the belief or the fear that he never would.
Reflecting on the man himself, the disciplined child, the KGB officer, the faceless deputy, the quiet successor, the loud savior, the myth who is Vladimir Putin? Or is the answer simply the mask, the mirror?
It's perhaps all and none of those things. His power stemmed less from charisma, more from opacity. From the very beginning, he seemed to reveal only what the specific moment required: obedience, loyalty, steadiness, later, strength and destiny. Never a consistent vision, always a dominating presence. And this presence, cultivated through ambiguity, was perhaps his greatest weapon.
The man who didn't blink, didn't interrupt, didn't reveal emotion.
And into that silence, others projected what they needed or feared: reformer, nationalist, efficient manager, protector, existential threat. But perhaps those were masks too, useful until they weren't, replaced without notice. Even those supposedly closest to him often said, "You never really know what he's thinking." Not truly unknowable maybe, but a master of withholding, allowing him to remain everything and nothing simultaneously.
Mirrors reflect us. Masks show others what they need to see.
And Putin learned to be the mirror. Let others see their hopes, fears, nostalgia reflected back. Then stand still and let those projections do the work. Yet, behind every mask, there's a face. Behind the face, a man who won't always be there. When that happens, the system he built might survive in some form, but the myth needs him. When the mask is finally gone, the mirror cracked, what remains might not be clarity, but an even deeper fog.
So history's verdict. It will be based on lasting impact, not temporary acclaim or control. How will it likely judge him?
It will undoubtedly be contested ground for generations. History remembers results, not necessarily loyalty or silence or command presence or applause ratings.
Some will say he saved Russia.
Saved it from collapse, restored pride and order, made the world listen again after the perceived humiliations of the 90s.
Others will say he.
Silenced a generation, destroyed a neighboring country, robbed Russia of a different future, ruled too long, too harshly, left too little foundation for what comes next.
And both viewpoints might hold elements of truth, yet be incomplete.
That's the nature of complex legacies. Putin's is a paradox. He began in a vacuum, built verticality, stability, and myth. He replaced chaos with control, then control with narrative, and narrative with a sense of permanence. But in doing so, he tied the fate of a vast country almost entirely to his own figure.
When he rose, Russia stood taller in some ways. When he stalled, Russia froze. When he struck, Russia bled.
And when he eventually falls from power, the aftermath is largely unknown, precisely because no one dared to publicly imagine it, let alone plan for it. The final verdict might not hinge on the length or harshness of his rule, but on its sheer completeness, its deliberate leaving of no blueprint for what comes after. History will debate the wars, the wealth, the wounds, the wasted chances, but it may remember most the shape of the silence he cultivated and the long, uncertain years that follow as a nation blinks in the sunlight after decades lived in a shadow cast by one man who believed he could write history and somehow never be written by it.
As we conclude this deep dive, we've traced a path from post-war Leningrad through the KGB, the turbulent 90s, the consolidation of power, the crafting of a national myth, and the profound ongoing consequences of the war in Ukraine. The complexity and contested nature of Putin's legacy are undeniable.
Absolutely. A full understanding requires acknowledging those multiple perspectives, the deep impact on Russia itself, and the far-reaching long-term consequences of his decades in power, consequences we are still grappling with today.
We want to leave you with a question to reflect on. What enduring lessons about the nature of power, about leadership, and perhaps about the intricate relationship between individual will and the broader forces of history emerge from this exploration of Vladimir Putin's life? And how might those insights inform our understanding of current global events and maybe even future possibilities? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.